I heard it again last night. That faint scratching behind the wall where no wall should have a space behind it. 3 distinct taps, followed by a slow, deliberate drag across the plaster, like fingernails testing the barrier between 2 worlds. I've started sleeping with the lights on, but that only makes the shadows darker when my eyes inevitably close. My name is Evelyn Carter, and until 3 weeks ago, my life in this suburban Phoenix neighborhood was perfectly ordinary. I'd moved into the ranch-style house on Willow Creek Drive after my divorce, looking for a fresh start in a quiet community where the most exciting event was supposed to be the monthly book club meeting at Mrs. Sanderson's house across the street. The real estate listing had advertised charming character and vintage appeal, code for hasn't been renovated since 1973. But the price was right, and I needed to stretch my settlement as far as possible. The house greeted me with the peculiar stillness of places long unoccupied. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through the west-facing windows, and the wooden floors creaked a welcome that echoed through empty rooms. The layout was simple: a modest living room connected to a kitchen with faded yellow countertops, 2 bedrooms separated by a bathroom with mint green fixtures, and an unfinished basement accessible through a door off the kitchen. Nothing remarkable, nothing ominous, just a slightly outdated house waiting to be filled with furniture and memories. I noticed the first oddity 3 days after moving in. I'd arranged my books alphabetically on the built-in shelves in the living room, a small ritual of order amidst the chaos of unpacked boxes. The next morning, I found 3 volumes out of place: Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's stories I'd owned since college. They were stacked neatly on the coffee table I'd positioned precisely in the center of the room. I dismissed it as the lingering mental fog of moving day, returned the books to their designated spots, and continued unpacking. 2 nights later, I woke at precisely 3:17 a.m., the glowing digits of my alarm clock burning into my consciousness before I registered what had disturbed my sleep. The temperature in the room had dropped dramatically. My breath clouded in front of my face. Though Phoenix in September rarely dips below 70 degrees, even at night, as I reached for the extra blanket at the foot of my bed, I noticed a shadow move across the wall. Not the familiar silhouette of branches from the elm tree outside my window, but something fluid, something deliberate. It paused when I gasped, hovering in the corner where ceiling met wall, before melting into the darkness. I told myself it was just a trick of light and half-sleep. The strange cold snap was likely a quirk of the aging HVAC system, something to mention to the home inspector who had clearly missed a few issues. Yet when I called the repair company the next morning, the technician found nothing wrong after a thorough inspection. "System's working perfectly, ma'am," he said, wiping dust from his hands with a rag that had once been white. "But these older houses, they've got their own way of breathing. Sometimes they just get cold for no reason." His casual remark lingered in my mind as I tried to settle into a routine. The house did seem to have a rhythm of its own, creaking at odd hours, rooms warming and cooling independent of the thermostat's settings. The subtle but persistent sense that space is changed slightly When I wasn't looking directly at them, the hallway seemed to stretch just a bit longer at night. The shadows in the bathroom never quite matched the objects casting them. The stain on the kitchen ceiling, just old water damage, my realtor had assured me, sometimes appeared to have spread when I returned home from work, only to recede to its original boundaries by morning. I might have attributed all of this to the natural adjustment period of getting to know a new home's peculiarities, if not for what happened at the end of my first week. I'd been working late, grading papers for my 9th grade English class, when the power went out. Not unusual in an older neighborhood, especially with the monsoon season approaching. I navigated to the kitchen by the light of my phone to find the emergency candles I'd unpacked days earlier. As I struck a match, illuminating the small kitchen in a warm glow, I noticed a figure reflected in the window above the sink. Someone standing behind me in the doorway. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but the doorway was empty. When I turned back to the window, the reflection was gone, replaced by my own pale face staring back with wide, frightened eyes. But for that brief moment, I'd seen someone else, a woman with hollow cheeks and dark, sunken eyes, wearing what looked like a nightgown from another era, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. I blamed exhaustion and the play of shadows, but that night, I dreamed of her, the woman from the window, standing at the foot of my bed, pointing toward the wall, where I now heard the scratching. In the dream, she spoke without moving her lips, her voice echoing as if traveling a great distance. They sealed her in. They didn't want anyone to know. I woke drenched in sweat, despite the chill in the room, the words fading, but their impression lingering like an aftertaste. Sunlight streamed through my curtains, reassuringly normal, but as I made my coffee, I found myself staring at the wall between the kitchen and what I'd been using as a home office. According to the house plans I'd received at closing, that wall should have been about 6 inches thick. Looking at it now, in the morning light, it appeared significantly thicker, perhaps 2 feet or more, an architectural oddity I hadn't noticed before, or something more deliberate. I spent that Saturday examining the wall, measuring the dimensions of the rooms on either side, and comparing them to the overall floor plan. There was indeed a discrepancy, a space approximately 3 feet wide, and the length of the kitchen that wasn't accounted for in any room. A sealed room, perhaps, or just an unusually wide structural support. My rational mind suggested the latter, but the dream woman's words echoed. They sealed her in. That evening, my neighbor Mrs. Sanderson brought over a welcome basket filled with homemade jam and local wine. I invited her in for coffee, eager for human interaction after days of growing unease. As we sat in my kitchen, I casually mentioned the peculiar wall. "Oh, honey," she said, her expression shifting from neighborly warmth to something more guarded. "This house has been renovated so many times over the years. The family before you only stayed 8 months. The ones before them, not even 6. Why so brief?" I asked, trying to keep my tone conversational, despite the chill that crept up my spine at her words. Mrs. Sanderson glanced at the wall, then down at her cup. People have different tolerances for historical quirks. This neighborhood was built on what used to be the edge of town back in the 1950s. Before that, it was just desert, and a few scattered homesteads. She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. The original house on this property burned down in 1962. There was a family, the Whitakers. Only the father survived. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. But after she left, I searched online for information about the fire. I found a few digitized newspaper clippings from the Arizona Republic. Tragic fire claims mother and child. The article was brief, mentioning only that Margaret Whitaker, 34, and her daughter Emily, 8, perished in a house fire of undetermined origin, while husband and father, Richard Whitaker, was working an overnight shift at the copper mine. A follow-up piece a week later noted that investigators had ruled the cause as likely electrical, common in homes of that era. The article included a small photograph of the Whitaker family: Richard, stern-faced and thin-lipped; Margaret, fair-haired with a distant expression; and between them, little Emily, her face partially obscured by a shadow across the film, but her eyes clearly visible, large and solemn in a child's face. I stared at those eyes until my vision blurred, unable to shake the feeling that they were somehow familiar. That night, the scratching behind the wall grew more insistent, and for the first time, I thought I heard something else. A child's faint humming, muffled but distinct. The melody hauntingly familiar, though I couldn't place it. The next morning, I woke to find all the kitchen cabinets standing open, their contents undisturbed but fully exposed, as if someone had been searching for something specific. The digital clock on my microwave was blinking 3:17, though there had been no power outage, and on the refrigerator door, held in place by a magnet I didn't recognize, an old-fashioned schoolhouse, was a child's drawing, done in crayon, a house with flames leaping from the windows, and 3 stick figures, 2 inside the house, 1 standing apart, holding what appeared to be a lighter. I stood frozen before that crude drawing, my coffee forgotten in my hand. I lived alone. I had no children in my life who might have created such a disturbing image. The doors and windows had been locked all night, yet here was evidence that someone, had invaded my space while I slept. With trembling fingers, I removed the drawing and turned it over. On the back, in the uneven block, letters of a child learning to write. Daddy did it. The chill that had periodically invaded my home seemed to take up permanent residence in my bones as I sank into a kitchen chair, the paper clutched in my hand. This was no longer something I could rationalize away as the settling of an old house or the hyper-vigilance of living alone for the first time. Something was happening in my home, something connected to a tragedy from decades before I was born. I called in sick to work and drove to the county records office, spending hours poring over property documents, old maps, and newspaper archives on microfiche. I learned that after the fire, Richard Whitaker had indeed rebuilt on the same property, the house I now occupied. He had lived there alone until his death in 1985, after which the house had passed through a series of owners, none staying longer than 2 years, until a family named Everett purchased it in 1997. They had stayed for 7 years, the longest anyone had managed, before selling to a couple who lasted only 4 months. The rapid turnover continued until I became the latest in the line of hopeful owners. The most disturbing discovery came buried in a small article from 1986, a year after Richard Whittaker's death. During renovations by the new owners, workers had discovered a hidden space behind a false wall in the kitchen, exactly where I had measured the discrepancy. The article, just a small filler piece on page 12, mentioned only that unspecified remains had been found and that police were investigating. I could find no follow-up story, no resolution to the macabre discovery. I sat in my car in the records office parking lot, struggling to decide my next move. The rational choice would be to list the house immediately, disclose what I had learned, and suffer the financial loss. Yet something held me back. Not just the practical considerations of another move so soon, but a growing sense of obligation to understand what was happening. If Margaret and Emily Whittaker had not died in a fire as reported, if Richard had done something more sinister and sealed the evidence behind a wall, didn't they deserve to have the truth uncovered? Or was I being manipulated by whatever force had drawn that chilling picture and left it for me to find? I returned home as dusk gathered, the house silhouetted against the darkening sky, looking innocent enough. Just an aging ranch house with peeling trim and a slightly sagging roofline. Inside, everything appeared normal. The drawing I had left on the kitchen counter was gone, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole episode. Then I noticed the schoolhouse magnet still on the refrigerator, and beside it now, a small handprint in what looked like ash. That night, I placed a voice recorder on the kitchen counter, aimed at the wall where I'd heard the scratching. I wasn't sure what I expected to capture. Perhaps nothing, which would at least suggest I'd been experiencing some sort of stress-induced hallucination rather than an actual haunting. I set it to record and retreated to my bedroom, leaving all the lights on as I attempted to sleep. The scratching began at midnight, earlier than before and more insistent. It moved across the wall in a pattern now. 3 scratches. Pause. 3 more. Pause. Then a long, continuous drag that raised the hair on my arms despite the 2 blankets I had wrapped myself in against the unnatural cold. Then came the humming, louder than previous nights. Resolving into a tune I finally recognized, Ring Around the Rosie, that deceptively cheerful nursery rhyme with its dark, historical undertones. I forced myself to remain in bed, fists clenched in the blankets, reminding myself that the recorder was capturing everything. I would have evidence in the morning, something concrete to take to. To whom? Who exactly does one consult about a house where a murdered child leaves crayon drawings about her father's crimes? At 3:17 a.m., that specific time again, the humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, taut with expectation. Then my bedroom door, which I had firmly closed before getting into bed, slowly swung open. The hallway beyond was darker than it should have been, with all the lights I'd left on. Standing in that unnatural darkness was a small silhouette, the size and shape of a child of perhaps 8 or 9 years. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, even to my own ears. The figure took 1 step forward, the movement jerky and unnatural, like film running at the wrong speed. Another step brought her, to the foot of my bed. I could make out the outline of a dress or nightgown, hair in what might have been braids, but the face remained in shadow despite the lamp glowing on my nightstand. "What happened to you, Emily?" I managed to ask, fighting against the terror threatening to close my throat. The figure raised one arm, pointing not at me, but beyond me, at the wall behind my bed. The wall that, I suddenly realized, would be the other side of that sealed space I'd identified earlier. When she spoke, the voice was not what I expected. Not a child's voice, but something ancient and layered, as if multiple voices spoke in imperfect unison. "He brought her here first. Mommy tried to stop him. He buried us both." The lamp beside my bed flickered, dimmed, and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight just in time to see the child figure glide backward into the hallway, still facing me, still pointing, heart pounding. I did something I still can't quite believe. I followed. The hallway stretched before me, seeming longer than the physical dimensions of my house should allow. The figure drifted backward, maintaining the same distance between us no matter how quickly I moved. We passed the kitchen, all the cabinets open again, drawers pulled out as well this time, and continued to the door that led to the basement. The door swung open by itself, revealing stairs descending into absolute darkness that even my phone's light couldn't penetrate. The figure of Emily, if that's who it was, disappeared into that void. I stood at the threshold, every instinct screaming to turn around, to run, to get out of the house entirely. But the compulsion to understand, to uncover the truth that had been buried for decades, drove me forward. I placed my foot on the first step, wincing at its groan beneath my weight. My phone's light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, illuminating only the next few steps directly in front of me. I continued downward, counting 17 steps before reaching the basement floor, a number that struck me as wrong, though I couldn't immediately recall how many there should have been. The basement was unfinished, with a concrete floor and cinder block walls, empty except for the water heater, furnace, and a few boxes of holiday decorations left by previous owners that I hadn't yet bothered to remove. My light swept the space, revealing nothing unusual until it reached the far corner. There, the concrete of the floor seemed different, newer, a slightly different shade of gray, in a roughly rectangular area, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The child figure stood beside this area, pointing down at it. As I approached, my light passed through her form as if she were made of mist, briefly illuminating features twisted in a silent scream before she vanished entirely. I stood alone in the basement, staring at that patch of concrete, the implications horrifyingly clear. What had the ghostly voice said? He buried us both, not a sealed space in the wall, but here, under the basement floor, the foundation of the house Richard Whittaker had built after supposedly losing his family in a fire. My phone's light flickered once, twice, and went out. The battery drained, despite having been at 80% when I entered the basement. In the sudden darkness, I became aware of sounds around me, breathing not my own, the shuffle of footsteps on concrete, a low masculine chuckle directly behind me. A new voice spoke, rough with cigarettes and malice. They should have stayed, quiet, just like you should. Something cold and hard pressed against the back of my neck. The barrel of a gun, I realized with rising panic. But how could a ghost hold a physical weapon? Unless you're not Richard Whittaker, I said, the words emerging surprisingly steady despite my terror. Smart lady, the voice replied, pressing the gun harder against my skin. Richard's been gone a long time, but some of us who come into this house, we get to hear his side of the story. See, those two nagging women drove him to it. And little Emily, she saw what she shouldn't have. Richard, with the babysitter, threatened to tell her mommy, so Richard had to shut her up, permanent-like. My mind raced, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't a ghost. This was a living person, likely the previous owner. One of those who had fled after a short stay. Someone who hadn't fled because of the haunting, but because he had become part of it, influenced by whatever evil lingered in the house. Margaret found out what he'd done to Emily, I said slowly, playing for time, trying to edge away from the gun at my neck. So he killed her too, made it look like they both died in the fire. Oh, she didn't just find out, the voice said, a note of glee in its tone. She walked in while he was putting little Emily in the wall. He had to handle her right then and there. Messy business. But the fire took care of the evidence upstairs. No one would have ever known about what was down here if those idiots in '86 hadn't decided to renovate. But they found remains, I said, remembering the article. There was an investigation. The man chuckled again. Remains so old, they couldn't prove much. And Richard had friends in the department back then. Case closed. Ruled historical. The new owners got spooked. Sold cheap. Pattern repeats. Some run because they see things. Some run because they start to understand Richard's point of view. As he spoke, I became aware of a faint glow emerging from that different colored patch of concrete. A soft blue luminescence that gradually took the shape of two figures, a woman and a child, holding hands, their faces sorrowful, but their eyes fixed on something behind me. The man must have sensed my attention shift as he started to turn. In that moment of distraction, I ducked away from the gun, lunging toward the stairs. His enraged roar followed me as I scrambled upward, missing steps in my blind panic. Behind me, a gunshot exploded in the confined space, the bullet splintering. The wooden handrail inches from my hand. I reached the top of the stairs, slammed the basement door, and fumbled with the lock, a flimsy thing that wouldn't hold for more than seconds against a determined intruder. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs as I fled through the kitchen, grabbing my car keys from the counter. The front door was only feet away when an invisible force slammed it shut before I could reach it. I pulled at the handle, finding it immovable despite being unlocked. Behind me, the basement door crashed open. I turned, back pressed against the front door, to face my pursuer. He emerged from the kitchen, a man in his 50s, unkempt and wild-eyed, the gun steady in his hand as he advanced. "You can't leave," he said, his voice eerily calm now. "No one leaves until they understand. Richard makes sure of that." As he raised the gun, a cold wind swept through the house, rattling windows and sending papers swirling through the air. The lights flickered rapidly, and in each momentary darkness, I glimpsed them, Margaret and Emily Whittaker, no longer sorrowful, but vengeful, their forms growing more solid with each blackout. The man saw them too, his expression shifting from menace to confusion, then to terror. "No," he whispered. "You're supposed to be on my side." Richard said whatever Richard had said was lost as the lights went out completely. In the darkness, I heard the man scream, a sound cut short by a wet, gurgling noise when emergency lights from a passing police car briefly illuminated the room. Seconds later, he was alone in the center of the living room, the gun on the floor beside him, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, a crayon drawing clutched in his rigid hand. I should have run then. The front door had swung open on its own, offering escape, but some horrified fascination kept me rooted in place as I watched dark stains spread across the man's chest, 5 distinct wounds in the pattern of a small handprint. The police car continued past without stopping, unaware of the drama unfolding inside my house. As its lights faded, taking the brief illumination with them, I heard that childish humming start again, ring around the rosy pocket full of posies, and felt a small, cold hand slip into mine. "He can't hurt you now," Emily's voice said from the darkness beside me. "But Mother says we need your help. We can't rest until everyone knows what Daddy did." The lights flickered back on, revealing an empty room save for the dead man on my floor, but the hand in mine remained invisible, yet undeniably present, squeezing with gentle insistence. I realized with dawning horror that I had a choice to make: flee this house and its tragic history, perhaps becoming the next person driven to madness and violence by whatever influence had corrupted the man now dead before me, or stay and help Emily and Margaret Whittaker find justice after decades of silent suffering. The small, cold hand tugged mine, pulling me toward the kitchen, toward that wall hiding secrets, and the basement where 2 bodies had lain undetected for 24 years before their partial discovery, toward the truth that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal, a truth that had twisted minds and claimed lives for over 6 decades. And despite everything, I found myself following the whispered promise echoing in my mind. "Help us and we'll let you go. Deny us and you'll never leave this place." Not really. No one ever does. I know I should be terrified, but as Emily leads me toward the kitchen, I feel something else replacing my fear, a growing sense of purpose, of righteous anger on behalf of this child and her mother. And beneath that, a whisper of something darker, a voice that might be Richard's, or might be something older still, that was here before any of us, suggesting that perhaps understanding comes at a price, and that once I uncover the full truth buried in this house, I too might find it impossible to leave. The hand in mine tightens its grip as we reach the kitchen, and I notice the drawer containing my knives has been pulled open, the largest blade gleaming in the overhead light. Beside it lies a hammer, and I don't remember owning one quite like that. Heavy and old-fashioned, rust speckling its metal head in patterns that look disturbingly like dried blood. "First the wall," Emily's voice whispers, though I still see no one beside me. "Then the floor. Mother says you'll know what to do after that." I reach for the hammer, its weight familiar in my hand, as if I've wielded it before, in this room, for this purpose. And perhaps, in a way, I have just another link in the chain of inhabitants caught in the cycle of revelation and concealment that defines this house. As I raise the hammer toward the wall where the scratching first attracted my attention, I catch a glimpse of movement in the window reflection. Not Emily or Margaret, or even the previous owner I just watched die, but my own face, my features arranged in an expression I don't recognize, a smile that doesn't belong to me. Behind that reflection, just for an instant, I see another face superimposed over mine. A man's face, thin-lipped and stern, his eyes alight with terrible satisfaction as the hammer falls. I realize now, too late, that Richard Whittaker never truly left this house, and I may have just invited him in. The hammer connects with the wall, and somewhere in the house, a door slams shut with the finality of a coffin lid dropping into place.